Okay, this will be my fourth response to the CES letter. Before I continue, let me reiterate again that this is simply my own opinions and thoughts. This should not be taken as official source of the church doctrine or from the church leaders. But let us get into this CES letter, section 1. We are still working on the Book of Mormon. Here is what they say. This is issue number 4. DNA analysis has concluded that Native American Indians do not originate from the Middle East or from Israelites, but rather from Asia. Why did the church change the following section of the introduction page in the 2006 edition of the Book of Mormon shortly after the DNA results were released? And then they quote the two introductions. The old introduction states they are the principal ancestors of the American Indians, and the new edition states they are among the ancestors of the American Indians. Now, the letter was written in 2013, and they do have an update, which I will get to later on in the video. For now, we will simply address this initial point. First thing to consider is that the introduction page of the Book of Mormon is not considered inspired scripture. It was not in any edition of the Book of Mormon until 1981, and therefore a change in that introduction is truly meaningless when speaking of church doctrine. This particular change is practically meaningless even in its context of what it is saying. One says principal, one says among. If they are the principal ancestors, then it is acknowledged by that very word that there are other ancestors, other groups who are among the ancestors of the American Indians. By saying they are among the ancestors, you are not saying that they are not the principal ancestors, but you are simply more directly acknowledging the other possible ancestry, which the first wording already did. So the difference is so subtle as to be meaningless to anyone who is really paying attention. However, the change is not as groundbreaking as may first appear. Back in 1957, Elder Richard L. Evans, who was a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles from 53 to 71, was interviewed and gave this description of the Book of Mormon. He described it as part of a record of both sacred and secular of prophets and people who, with supplementary groups, were among the ancestors of the American Indians. Now, the description he gave, remember, this is an apostle giving this description. This was presented and approved by the First Presidency and published in the book Religions of America by Leo Roston. This book is basically a collection of interviews that Leo Roston did with various leaders of the different religions and denominations in the United States. And therefore, this interview and this description carries with it the approval of the First Presidency or the prophet of the church. The introduction page of the Book of Mormon was added about 25 years later, and as I say, the meaning is essentially the same. The difference is very subtle, nearly non-existent. But the fact that an official statement was given by the First Presidency, or approved by the First Presidency, given by one of the 12 apostles, that used this wording, or what has been reported as the new wording, shows that the change is not really a change at all. It is a change of semantics, not a change of substance. Okay, now, besides this supposed change, they say, well, they make the claim that the American Indians are not descended from the Middle East, but from Asia. Now, this is the update that they provide since the CES letter was published originally in 2013. This update states, the church conceded in its January 2014 Book of Mormon and DNA Studies essay that the majority of Native Americans carry largely Asian DNA. The church, through this essay, makes a major shift in narrative from its past dominant narrative and claims of the origins of the Native American Indians. Now, I'm going to go through a couple of quotes from this essay titled Book of Mormon and DNA Studies, which you can read the entire essay on the church website. And from these quotes, it should be obvious that the church has not changed their narrative in any way. The essay actually does a very good job of pointing out that all these claims to know that the American Indian is descended from Asia is a bunch of hogwash. Genetics can't tell us who they are descended from. All they can tell us is what their DNA is similar to. Okay, so in the interview at the beginning of the essay, they do acknowledge that so far the DNA that has been collected and cataloged of the American Indians does seem to carry genetic profiles or markers that are most similar with Asian or primarily East Asian DNA. However, at the end of the interview, they also make this statement. It says, in short, DNA studies cannot be used decisively to either affirm or reject the historical authenticity of the Book of Mormon. In other words, while they have Asian DNA, that is not proof that they are not descended from the Middle East and Israelites. They continue in the essay to lay out exactly why you can't use DNA to make this kind of a claim, and they do it very well. If you want to go and read the entire essay, I would very much encourage it. But we have a couple of examples that they give us. In the first section after the overview, titled The Ancestors of the American Indians, they say the following. What seems clear is that the DNA of Book of Mormon peoples likely represented only a fraction of all DNA in ancient America. Now, what they're saying here in this essay is that yes, we have the people of the Book of Mormon. They lived at this particular time. But were they the only people in America? Now, there are people who do believe that there were other groups already in America when Lehi and his family came and the Nephites and Lamanites gave rise to their nations that are recorded in the Book of Mormon. Now, me personally, I don't believe there were other people here when they came, but there likely were others who came after, especially after the time that the Book of Mormon records. The Book of Mormon ends around 400 AD. That means we had almost 1100 years from the end of the Book of Mormon to the arrival of the Europeans. The fact that other people, or the idea that other people came during that 1100 years, to me, makes perfect sense. And they would have blended their DNA in. We know, for instance, the Vikings came over, around 900, landing on the northeast in Canada. There's evidence that the Chinese and Japanese made contact with the west coast, both of the United States and Mexico. So there's evidence, even though we know, Columbus, he made his famous voyage in 1492, but even about 100 years before that, there's evidence that the Portuguese made contact with the east coast of South America without realizing they had found a new continent, thinking it was just an island. So we have all this evidence that other people came to the Americas, that the people of the Book of Mormon are not the only people here. And because of this, we can't be certain whose DNA is showing up in the modern peoples. When we test Indians of today, Native Americans, we can't know whose DNA they have inherited. Now, the essay continues, and it goes through all of the details of how this works. So in the section of understanding the genetic evidence, they lay all this out very well, and I want to read a couple of quotes here. First, it says here, ongoing studies continue to provide new insights that both challenge and confirm previous conclusions. For example, a 2014 study indicates that as much as 1/3 of Native American DNA may have originated anciently in Europe or West Asia. They also point out that Europe, West Asia, and even African DNA is found in Native American populations. And determining when this DNA was introduced to the population is nearly impossible. Was it after European conquest and the European migrations? Or was it before, during the time such as the Book of Mormon peoples? And one geneticist, one population geneticist called Marcus Feldman of Stanford University stated, models that suggest a single one-time migration are generally regarded as idolized systems. There may have been small amounts of migrations going on for millennia. So the whole claim of DNA with the Book of Mormon is the claim that only the people in the Book of Mormon are the ancestors of modern-day American Indians. That there was no other migration, no other mixing of DNA, just the people of the Book of Mormon until we get the Europeans coming over in the 1500s. And what they're saying is that this idea is not only not supported by the science, but it is also not supported by the Book of Mormon itself. Now, given all of this, how are we to test DNA in the modern day and determine where it came from anciently? Now, the rest of the essay discusses three effects within population genetics that would make determining the ancestry of American Indians nearly impossible. Specifically, determining if they were descended from the Book of Mormon peoples. The first is known as the founder effect. And they give us an example. There's a Professor Perego, I believe. He is named in the essay. And he is proven through genealogical records to be a multi-generational Italian. But when his DNA is tested, it comes back as being Asian. So we have an Italian with Asian DNA. And if his family was to go off and settle an island, then in 300 or 400 years, you go back and you test that population, they would all come back with Asian DNA. Yet their ancestry would originate from Italy. So the essay then concludes, this hypothetical story shows that conclusions about the genetics of a population must be informed by a clear understanding of the DNA of the population's founders. In the case of the Book of Mormon, clear information of that kind is unavailable. Meaning, until we can get Lehi's DNA, we can't tell who is descended from Lehi. Now, the other two effects that the essay addressed is, well, there's what's called the population bottleneck and genetic drift. Now, a population bottleneck is basically when a cataclysmic event such as a war, a pandemic, or natural disaster drastically reduces the population of a given area. When this happens, certain genetic profiles will be reduced or destroyed completely, and therefore no modern descendants will be found with those genetic profiles. The genetic drift is the random pattern of one generation to another, certain profiles gradually dying out as other profiles become dominant. The essay gives a very good explanation of both of these effects. I have decided to run my own little experiment. In the Book of Mormon, we have two events that could be described as a population bottleneck. One being the destruction at the death of Christ, and the next being 400 years later, the great wars that resulted in the utter destruction of the Nephite population. We have another population bottleneck when the Europeans come in the 1500s with the conquest and the pandemics that swept America, and some estimate as much as possibly 50% of the American population was destroyed in this event. A Michael H. Crawford observed that the conquest itself squeezed the entire American population through a genetic bottleneck. He concluded, this population reduction has forever altered the genetics of the surviving groups, thus complicating any attempts at reconstructing the pre-Columbian genetic structure of most New World groups. In the section of their conclusion, titled The Conclusion, the essay makes this following statement. Much as critics and defenders of the Book of Mormon would like to use DNA studies to support their views, the evidence is simply inconclusive. As Elder Dallin H. Oakes of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles observed, it is our position that secular evidence can neither prove nor disprove the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. So far from being a change or shift in the narrative of the church, this essay basically says, and what the whole point of the essay is that genetics cannot prove anything. We simply do not have enough information, and we don't have the ability to get enough information because we would need the genetics of the original population that lived 2,500 years ago. We don't have the capability of using this kind of study to prove one way or the other. The Book of Mormon was meant to be taken on faith, and secular science will never prove or disprove it. It must be taken on faith.